computer. All right, Shaun, take it away.
Okay. Okay, so my presentation was on academic freedom in Hong Kong and China, but also away from those countries. So really, I'm presenting some thoughts on mitigating risks for Chinese Hong Kong students and scholars abroad. And I have some experience, I guess, in this. So of course, I teach quite a lot of Chinese students at my university, Kyushu University. I've worked with Chinese student activists on a white paper petition campaign that was about 3 years ago during the time of the white paper protests in China. And lastly, academically, I've collaborated quite a lot with Chinese as well as Taiwanese scholars in a couple of edited books and also co-written papers with them. So hopefully I have some recommendations and ideas about mitigating those risks, but of course that's a take it or leave it basis for viewers. So I'm going to be leaving at 10:30. So if anyone has any questions for me, Joseph can relay them to me and I'll answer them, I guess, via Google Doc or Google Form as soon as I can. So basically some background first on the question of what the transnational suppression or of academic freedom means in the current context. And I think Kevin will expound on the legal background to this issue. I'm just going to go more into the broad sort of ideas of what this means. So firstly, a book published last year, Alexander Cooley and Alexander Jukalski's book, Dictating the Agenda, illustrates a disturbing new trend about authoritarian states' repression of free speech, that they are no longer playing defense on home ground. In recent years, they have optimized transnational communication technologies and institutions to dictate their agenda and also undermine liberal norms in foreign countries. So, internationalized institutions such as universities, dependent upon foreign funding and foreign students' revenue, are key battlegrounds, also key vectors for such transnational influence and repression. Um, and also, democratic backsliding in countries like the United States constitutes a new source of risk to free expression for foreign researchers and students in those countries. And Chinese and Hong Kong scholars and students abroad can face both such risks. And I've heard from Chinese scholar friends in the United States that they're fearful both the United States government's powers to arbitrarily cancel their visas, to detain and interrogate them when they're returning from China to the United States, and they're fearful of the Chinese government. Okay, this is quite annoying. Okay, I'm just going to proceed with a non uh, a non-slideshow version for my PowerPoint slides. Okay, so some notable instances of transnational repression of Chinese Hong Kong students and scholars abroad. They include Vera Yueming Zhao, a student at the University of Washington, detained and imprisoned in 2017 for 5 months following a visit home to Xinjiang, ostensibly for using a VPN to submit her university homework. And I've seen a letter of protest written by alumni of the University of Washington, which accused the university of refusing to give her support because apparently it was negotiating a very lucrative funding deal with funding sources inside China. Another case which I've taken a particular interest in, Yuan Kechin, a professor at Hokkaido University of Education, who was detained on a home visit for his mother's funeral in 2019, subsequently indicted in 2021 for espionage. His case remains ongoing, and there's no further information about him at this time. Yang Hengzhen, a Chinese Australian visiting scholar at Columbia University, detained in 2019 during a visit to renew his family's visas, and sentenced to death with reprieve on espionage charges in 2024. And finally, Mika Yuan, a Hong Kong student studying in Japan, detained in 2023 after returning to Hong Kong to renew her identity card, and sentenced to 2 months imprisonment for sedition over social media posts critical of China and supporting Hong Kong independence, which she had posted while in Japan. So my basic question is, well, as teachers, peers, and scholarly collaborators, how can we help Chinese Hong Kong scholars and students to mitigate such risks? So, as I said, what I'm going to be giving here are kind of advice or recommendations based largely on my own experience. And I said it's open for people to question or discuss them critically. So, as teachers, well, first, I really want to make it clear that you don't need to self-censor course syllabuses and content. Your and your students' academic freedom should remain a preeminent value. Also, push back against students who attempt to police your or other students' classroom statements relating to course content, and treat threats or intimidation as disciplinary infractions. Now, that being said, there are teachers or instructors who treat their classrooms as a bully pulpit for their personal activist or political views, who might single out students of particular nationality, for example, Chinese students, and lecture them about Tiananmen Square or other human rights abuses in China which are not related to the course syllabus. Or, for example, they might single out Jewish or Israeli Jewish students about the Palestinian issue or Gaza. I think this is not a good thing for teachers to do at all. So I am talking about syllabus and classroom related, syllabus and curriculum related statements rather than sort of gratuitous political statements that some instructors might feel motivated to give. Next, when students approach you with concerns that other students may surveil their classroom statements on politically sensitive subjects, take them seriously and discuss alternative anonymized means for them to fulfill classroom discussion requirements regarding those subjects. And last, where a pattern emerges of repeated instances of state-directed or self-deputized surveillance, intimidation, or threats to Chinese or Hong Kong student speech and extramural utterance, including statements in social media, approach your colleagues and faculty, work out a unified policy to mitigate those risks. Framed, I think, and this is a really important point, framed as a duty of care to those students of the same sort that you would extend to any other students of irrespective of their nationality. Okay, and as student peers, if a Chinese or Hong Kong student friend confides to you that they're under surveillance or intimidation from fellow national students or from authorities back home or in the country where your university is located, take them seriously, hear them out, and also respect their requests for privacy. Make sure your online communications with them is appropriately securitized and follow their specific requests to securitize your communications with them. And following any specific requests for assistance, try and support them in whatever way you can. I mean, for example, emotional support or in bringing their concerns to your professor's attention or even to the attention of high university authorities. And last, as scholarly collaborators. Again, remember that your and your Chinese or Hong Kong scholarly collaborators' academic freedom is paramount over any preemptive urge of your own to self-censor. So respect their wishes to be anonymized or to be screened from being publicly identified when they participate with you in public discussion venues where politically sensitive issues are under discussion, particularly online. Also respect their wish not to participate in any collaborative, scholarly, or extramural undertaking which they deem will put them at risk. And this, again, is based on my experience. A Chinese scholarly collaborator refused to request uh, to participate along with me in forums where he thought that he would be at risk of having his scholarly interests, I guess, being leaked back to authorities in China. And in both those cases, of course, I deferred to his judgment, and we cancelled both those. We rejected both those requests to participate in those forums. And where you are the senior or supervising scholar in a research project, take seriously your junior collaborators' concerns about risky academic venues or publishers, and be prepared to consider alternatives. And lastly, where a Chinese or Hong Kong scholarly collaborator is at risk or is persecuted, consider how far your duty of collegiality or care extends in trying to aid them. A case I particularly have in mind is that of the Uyghur scholar Todi Tunyats, who was a doctoral candidate at the University of Tokyo in 1998. He was arrested in Xinjiang, in the Xinjiang city of Urumqi, while undertaking archival research for his doctorate. His doctoral supervisors undertook a decade-long campaign to have him freed from jail on the trumped-up charges which he'd been jailed for, and took his case all the way to the United Nations. Of course, not all of us have the resources or the capabilities to go as far as that. But in accordance with our abilities and our resources, I think we should do as much as we can as scholars to offer our support in those kinds of circumstances. Okay, so just to round off, um, what I've discussed here are really quite individualized kind of strategies or initiatives in response to academic freedom threats, and these will sound quite inadequate. Ideally, academics and university administration should be organizing to formulate unified policies for mitigating those threats. But we don't live in ideal times right now. So a lot then is now left to students, academics, activists, and media to apply public pressure on universities and on governments to uphold freedoms, academic freedoms for Chinese and Hong Kong students and scholars. Okay, so that's it from me. So yeah, I'll round off and I'll hand over to Kevin.
Sure, thank you so
Hey,
much, Sean. So before we hand off to Kevin, because I know, Sean, you have to leave pretty soon after, does anyone have any questions for just Sean, or otherwise we can move on to Kevin and take all the questions together at the end? What are we thinking? Does anyone have any burning questions for Sean? All right. Um, okay.
Oh,
So for now,
sorry. Oh,
Yes,
oh,
Chris, I think Chris wanted to say something. Chris Kohler?
It would be more like discussion because I had spent so much time in China and aligned with so many things like that. It would lead to questions, but I think it would be too lengthy right now.
Chris,
Carry
sorry,
on.
you're really muffled. Is there something wrong with your speakers?
Yeah, it's probably these things. Why don't we carry on and see if I can deal with that problem and do it later.
all right,
Okay,
that's
let's.
fine. Let's move over to Kevin then. Kevin, have you got your slides out?
yep, let me try and share them. Hold on. Mine are very short because I use them more as pointers. Hold on.
Sure, sure.
Share. Is it, what do I do? Sh
Share screen, it should be at the bottom.
yeah. Yeah. Oh, allow Zoom to share your screen. Yeah. What? Oh, I've got to allow. Sorry, didn't realize that I've locked share screen. What? It says I couldn't share my screen.
Oh,
That's and it says
um,
I've got to quit and reopen before I can share my screen. So what while I log out and log right back in,
okay, sure, of course, that's fine.
this is annoying. I apologize. I don't know what settings I've got on my computer.
Sure, no worries. Okay.
While we're waiting for Kevin, Sean, do you have any fun stories, such as uh, like the article that you published in the Diplomat, or anything else you want to share?
I yeah, there is one incident I wanted to share, but I wonder whether I've already shared it in a previous webinar. But it was an incident in a class where I was teaching civil disobedience, and we were discussing the question of conscience. And there were well, quite a lot of foreign students in the class. One of them was a Tanzanian student and a Muslim, and the other was Chinese, and they were good friends with each other. And just in the middle of this class, while we were discussing the topic, he suddenly said to his Chinese friend, "But don't you know about the Uyghurs in Xinjiang? Don't This is a terrible thing that's happening to them. Do you know anything about it?" And she got really flustered and went straight on to a Chinese search engine. I think it was Weibo. And I just decided I was going to handle this in a really low key way. So I just came up to her and gently tapped her on the shoulder and said, "Look, you're not going to find anything about this in Weibo. Google Uyghurs." And just by coincidence, I think about 6 months later, I noticed that a line of T-shirts was coming out, with a slogan "Google Uyghurs" on it, which I'm sure was a coincidence. But anyway, yeah, it was quite interesting to see that. But it was a potentially difficult situation. I mean, they remain friends as far as I know. But yeah, it's kind of important to be really tactful in those kinds of situations and handle them, so that no feathers are really ruffled, let's say.
Sure. Uh, just building on what Sean said, I have Chinese students, at Hanyang University, and I think as an academic, we always want to do balanced readings. So I do readings from both, pro and anti, CCC, Chinese Communist Party perspectives. And I always try to invite speakers who might be more sympathetic to the Communist Party. I couldn't get them to speak this semester, but hopefully they can speak next semester. Because I think as a member of Heterodox Academy and also as an academic, we want to show that, yeah, we really believe in open discourse. And so when I hear to I think professors, our job is not to impose any one perspective, but to help our students to learn about different perspectives and for students to make their own judgment. Okay, so thank you. And I think Kevin's ready now.
Yes.
Yep, thank you. Thank you all very much. I think before I move on to my much less impressive content compared with Sean's, I will start by just following on with one or two points that Sean made, and in particular relating to me now in academia, because actually the apart from the very nice introduction that Francis gave earlier, there are two other things about me. One is that the nicer bit is that I'm also a part-time lecturer at the University of Melbourne, where I'm doing a PhD in law. And also, I'm actually a Hong Kong wanted person over various allegations of national security law breaches. Now, and in fact, there's a $1 million Hong Kong bounty over my head from the Hong Kong authorities over that. And the reason why I mention it in the context of what Sean had been saying is that, in fact, that has affected the way I run my teaching, and also it even affected the sorts of subjects that I'm interested in teaching. So, for example, I try and get away from teaching um, constitutional law or human rights type subjects, because I know that that can be, it will be difficult for me not to discuss my situation in detail in those sorts of subjects, and it can become a little bit messy for some of my students. And so I teach mainly private and commercial law subjects, and even there, I make it very clear to my students that for so long as they are my students, I would not discuss politics with them in any shape or form. Now that's because I know that in Australia it's inevitable that either we've got a lot of Chinese students, or alternatively we've got even a lot of non-Chinese students would visit Hong Kong or China now and again. And I feel that it is important that if on the off chance that they ever get questioned about anything, they can credibly and honestly say that I refuse to discuss politics in class, so that it ends lines of questioning there might be against them. So, going back to what Sean was saying about transnational threats to academic freedom, well, in a way, the way I run classes and the subjects I choose to teach is one of the indicators of that. So, my presentation today is much more about just what's going on mainly in Hong Kong, but a little bit about China. Um, and let's see. Oh, mine doesn't. Oh, yes, mine works. Great. And so let me start with China. So China is very clear about um, academic freedom in its constitution. In fact, in Article 47 of the Chinese constitution, you see that they say there's a freedom to engage in scientific research and literary and artistic creation and other cultural pursuits. And that also goes with other guarantees of free expression in the Chinese constitution. Now, that's all very nice, but unfortunately, it's a pretty meaningless guarantee. So, um, we all know what happened in 1989 when student protests ended up in troops on the street killing many students. We know that there are various directives in China issued by various universities, and I don't want to start individualizing particular universities because so many of them do that. They actually issue directives empowering students to spy on teachers or what they say. There's also now a proliferation of Xi Jinping thought research centers across universities. And in fact, um, if you don't have those research centers, it's a risk in terms of your further university funding. Then I will also want to mention briefly document 9 of 2013 from the Chinese Communist Party General Office, because that document is famous for other reasons, for those of you who follow Chinese politics. It's that document where they said there are 7 Western concepts that you must never talk about, including, pluralist democracy, rule of law, judicial independence, you name it. Okay. So people know that document very well from the perspective of all the Western values that are being rejected. But actually, that document was more than just those 7 things. It also talked about, in the context of academic freedom, for example, the need to guard against what they call mistaken views that appear in public lectures, seminars, university classrooms, and class discussion forums. So that takes us actually back to the whole point about students being allowed to spy on teachers. So you can imagine the pressure on academics in China to toe the line even in class, let alone in research papers and the like. And if you want to know what happens to academics that don't toe the line, well, probably the most high-profile example in recent years has been now former Tsinghua University law professor Xu Jiangren. Now, for if any one of you is from Australia or New Zealand, from you might know that Xu Jiangren has an Australian connection in that he got his PhD from Melbourne University Law School. So, but anyway, he's been a long time critic of Xi Jinping's closing of civil society spaces, tightening of various rights to free speech, and so on. And for his sins, not only was he banned from teaching and ultimately sacked from Tsinghua University, but in 2020, he was actually charged and convicted of cavorting with prostitutes. So um, we often think of threats to academic freedom and attempts to silence academics in terms of them, being charged with political crimes, being charged with or being sacked from universities and the like. But actually, they go the extra mile in smearing these people's personal characters by bringing trumped up charges like, oh, you go to brothels, for example. So that's basically China in a nutshell. Now, turning to Hong Kong, let's hope my slides continue to work. Yes, okay. So you would have thought that Hong Kong things would be better under one country, two systems. And in a way, I'll come back to that. In a way, it kind of still is. I'll talk about that towards the end. But Article 137 of Hong Kong's Basic Law, which is the city's mini constitution promulgated by China, explicitly states that educational institutions of all kinds may retain their autonomy and enjoy academic freedom. Now, that all sounds very nice. The problem is that Hong Kong courts interpret this very narrowly. In fact, there's been case law that a where a student union leader had tried to sue a university for for infringing on the academic freedom of a particular academic. And the court actually said, no, you as student union, you have no standing in court to enforce the academic freedom guarantee. The academic freedom guarantee, because they interpreted the wording of Article 137 very narrowly, uh, the right to enforce academic guarantee falls with educational institutions only. So if a university feels that its academic freedom has been threatened, then it can go to court technically to try and enforce. But the problem is, we're talking about a system, like much of the developed world, where most, if not all, university funding come from governments, right? So, um, on what planet would these universities risk taking a government to court on threats to academic freedom when you know that the government can always find perfectly quote unquote legitimate economic and other reasons to cut their funding on all sorts of things, right? So in other words, the constitutional freedom to academic freedom in Hong Kong's basic law has been rendered pretty much useless in practice. Now, the other thing that's often mistaken is that people think that, oh, threats to academic freedom in Hong Kong only happened in the last, I don't know, 10, 12 years or so. But actually, that's not true. Um, as I'm going to come to, the first of the cases that I'll come to actually happened all the way back in 1999, 2000, when um, it was the first few years of Hong Kong under Chinese rule. So Robert Chung was an academic that ran an opinion polling program at the University of Hong Kong, and he researches into what, to use a really technical term, he's a psephologist, essentially, researches into the mechanics of elections, of polling, and so on. Okay. Now, over the course of 1999 and 2000, he was threatened by a senior advisor to Hong Kong Chief Executive's office that with all the opinion polling that came out from his center saying that the Hong Kong government was not popular, that if Robert Chung didn't stop what he was doing, funding for his center would dry up. And Robert Chung made it public, and in a way, you can say that there was a threat to academic freedom there, but it also shows back then how um, thing threats to academic freedom were taken more seriously back then. So when it all became public, the University of Hong Kong actually convened an independent inquiry over it, and there were damning findings against the senior government official who made those threats, and that senior government official ended up having to quit. Okay, so but what we can see is that even back then, um, way back in the late 90s, 2000, um, China was, or through their officials in Hong Kong, were trying to have a go at undermining academic freedom, even though it didn't succeed at the time. Then fast forward to, so the next four names I mentioned, Benny Tai, Chan Kin Man, Johannes Chan, and Xu Ka-chun. I'll probably talk about Benny Tai and Chan Kin Man and Xiu Kao Chun first, and I'll come back to Johannes Chan, although they're all in different ways linked with the Occupy Central movement in 2014. So Benny Tai and Chan Kin Man are probably names that those of you who are into Hong Kong and Chinese news would know well. They were two of the leaders of the Occupy Central movement in Hong Kong back in 2014, calling for Hong Kong democratization. That movement didn't really work, but nonetheless, both of them ended up in jail. In Benny Tai's case, he not only was he in jail for Occupy Central, he ended up doing other things like trying to coordinate the pro-democracy camp in elections. And even after the national security law came into force in Hong Kong in 2020, he led in the running of a primary election for legislative candidates for the pro-democracy camp, and he ended up being found guilty of subverting state power just for running a primary, essentially, and he's now in jail for 10 years. Now, the other thing, of course, was that the University of Hong Kong ended up sacking him in 2020. Okay. Chan Kin Man, after he came out from jail from Occupy Central, I think it's fair to say that he knew that the writing was up, the writing was on the wall, the game was up. So he gave a few final lectures and he retired from Chinese University of Hong Kong. For those of you who do Asian research, you would know that he is now in Academia Sinica in Taipei. And um, but in some ways, harassment against his work hasn't stopped because, for example, when he was involved in organizing a Hong Kong Studies conference in Taipei um, you know, in Taipei last year, the Chinese state media started running stories saying, this is an anti-China conference and everything. And as soon as those stories were run, a whole bunch of Hong Kong academics who were meant to attend that conference in Taipei in December last year all pulled out. So that's Chan Kin Man. And Xiu Ka-chun is kind of not so well known probably to those outside of Hong Kong, but he was actually Benny Tai's and Chan Kin Man's right-hand man, one of their right-hand men and women in the Occupy Central movement. He ended up spending time in jail as well for Occupy Central. And after he came out, he was sacked from by the Hong Kong Baptist University um, for his involvement in Occupy Central, essentially. Now I come to Johannes Chan, where his troubles with academic freedom were related to, but in some ways more insidious than those who were jailed as a result of Occupy Central itself. So Johannes Chan, respected constitutional law academic, at one stage was the dean of University of Hong Kong Law School. In 2014 and 2015, the University of Hong Kong was looking for a pro-vice chancellor to fill one of the vacancies. They convened an independent search committee consisting of, including a former Hong Kong Chief Justice, and the independent search committee unanimously recommended Johannes Chan for that promotion. As soon as that happened, both the then chief executive of Hong Kong, Leung Chun-ying, and China's state media in Hong Kong started making noises opposing this promotion, saying that Johannes Chan is an anti-China academic. And also he shielded Benny Tai, who's a criminal and what have you. And it got to a point where the University Council in 2015 ended up rejecting um, the recommendation of the independent search committee and didn't promote Johannes Chan. And worse still, in the process, they started smearing the guy by saying, oh, he's actually not a very good academic at all because he only got a master's degree and not a PhD, when in fact he's published more than most constitutional academics with PhDs. And they started trying to compare his work with others on the basis of Google citation impact factors and the like, right? So that's how heady it got in terms of them trying to reject him for a promotion. Then, very quickly, I'll talk about Al Kalon, journalism academic who again got suspended and ended up just quitting Chinese University of Hong Kong because um, he was involved in writing a few pieces that were accused of being seditious in a trial against two editors of Stan News, which was a Hong Kong online publication, um, and um, and he and in that trial, the editors got convicted and jailed. Al Lun wasn't jailed, but he ended up being stripped of his academic role. Student unions, since the national security law in Hong Kong, have been disaffiliated from universities. And in fact, even their umbrella organization, the Hong Kong Federation of Students, had to disband this year officially. Apologies, it's my son calling, and I'm trying to switch off the phone. Sorry. And and then finally, the threats are not only to academics specifically; it's also to individual students too. So most recently, I want to mention Miles Kwan. Now, obviously, he's not. He's not one of the names that most of you would know about. He's not a Joshua Wong. He's not a Nathan Law or things like that. But some of you would know that last year in Hong Kong, there was a catastrophic fire involving 7 apartment blocks where about 160 people got killed. This student, Miles Kwan, came out with leaflets uh, demanding accountability for the catastrophic fire, including failures on the part of the government. And for that, he got expelled from Chinese University of Hong Kong. So we're now talking about an environment in Hong Kong which is pretty grim. Are there silver linings? Yes, there are in a sense, because there are still academics around that try and skirt around the edges. So I know that, for example, there are academics in Hong Kong that still look at issues of authoritarian legality in the context of Hong Kong, albeit they've got to be very careful about what they say. But overall, the direction of travel in Hong Kong is very much towards what we are now seeing in China, and the differences in academic freedom between the two places have narrowed significantly. And with that, I am open to questions.
All right, thank you so much, Kevin. Um, yes, so as usual, we are opening for Q&A now. And I always want to prioritize the student questions first. So Joseph, is anyone in your class game?
You guys have a question? I think they need a minute to kind of to think of a question. So if there's anyone else in the audience, you can go ahead.
Yes, Chris, I see you got your hand up in your screen.
Yeah, well, can you hear me now?
Yes,
Oh,
yes,
it's
we can
much
hear
better
you.
now.
Yeah, sorry about that before. Yeah, more just a comment while the students are thinking. I was typing up that we also need to think about the difference between Taiwan and Hong Kong, where they're two entities that China has been trying to pull back into the fold of China in general. The difference between how people act there as opposed to abroad, that's just something I was thinking about and have no answer for or other comment. Just yeah, let's just leave it at that. And I'm hoping that the students will come up with some questions.
If students are not sure about what to ask, I'm always happy to talk about Korean legal dramas. I watch a lot of them on Netflix, so
Sure. Kevin, hi, this is Joseph.
yeah.
Oh,
Hi,
I think
Joseph.
I think Alex had a hand. Alex, do you want to go first?
Okay, thank you. Yeah, so thank you, Kevin, for your talk. I wanted to ask you if you could elaborate on the comment you made about your policies towards your own Chinese students. So
Well,
you,
my students overall, really, because it's not just Chinese students, right? I mean, lots of people visit China and Hong Kong, right?
right. Um, but you mentioned that your Chinese students might be especially at risk. That you have to take into account, and that's to your credit, that you're taking into account the political risks for them once they go back home. So I was wondering whether what kind of broad lessons you would draw from this regarding, since this discussion is partly about also protecting
Mm.
students, maybe Chinese students studying outside of China, because one benefit that is often touted for Chinese students studying abroad is that abroad they can be exposed to other perspectives. They can maybe learn about topics that are censored at home. And I'm
Mm.
wondering whether there is a kind of tension here between promoting that objective as opposed to whether that promote the pursuit of that objective has the downside that it might endanger Chinese students once they go back home, whether you expect that they might be interrogated or pressured somehow about what they learned or what they said abroad, if you would like to elaborate on this.
I think my personal situation is a little bit unusual, right? I mean, um, it's not every day that a student gets taught by a teacher who is on, um, the Chinese Communist Party's wanted list through their Hong Kong minions, right? So I'm not so much worried about them being exposed to ideas that they wouldn't be exposed to in China per se. I'm more worried about them being subject to any questioning about what I'm up to in class and being asked a lot of questions about it. But if I mean, it's the case that the subjects I teach, you know, how political can contract damages be, right? So, or tort damages be? That's what I'm teaching. Or next semester I'm teaching corporations law, right? So by what I'm by saying to them, look, safe to the extent strictly necessary for the subject. So we did talk a little bit of politics in the context of a class where we had to discuss Australian native title laws relating to the land rights of Indigenous Australians. I mean, it's always going to get a little bit political with those sorts of topics. But apart from that, um, I thought it was more prudent for me to avoid having discussions of politics with people who are still my students, lest I put them at risk. Obviously, if they cease being my students, so all exam papers have been marked, or marks have come out, appeal processes, and what have you over student results are over. If they then want to assume the risk themselves in a way, I don't want to put it too irresponsibly, but if they feel then that they're not scared and they still want to engage with me on those issues, I'm always happy to talk to them. But it's more that while I'm officially their teacher, I feel that I need to take care of them as much as I can. And it's from that sort of perspective that I issued that rule. I think it's fair to say that um, if you're not in my unique position, I would not encourage any academic to be self-censoring in that way.
Thanks for clarifying that.
Okay, I guess I can talk now. Hi, Kevin. Thanks so much for
Hi,
speaking.
Peter.
Yes, do you see me?
Yes, I can see you.
Okay, great. Just as a quick follow-up to Alex, I was wondering, like personally, I like to have coffee, lunch with my students outside of class. And so, do you have a policy for subjects that you can talk about with students outside of class, or do you basically this is just a blanket policy? I'm not gonna, as long as I'm your professor, I'm not gonna talk about politics with you, like either inside or outside of class.
Yeah, I'm pretty strict on that personally, right? And in fact, for those of you who teach in Australasia, you would know that Australian universities generally are now pretty strict about socializing with students outside of class anyway.
Okay.
So politics or not, I obviously, we will talk about, have a little bit of banter about, what we're going to do for the weekend and things like that before the start of class or end of class. But beyond that, um, I, I see Francis's head nodding, right? So beyond that, even without the politics or no politics rule, I would avoid socializing with students while they're still my students. As I've said, once they're no longer my students, if they still want to come up and talk to me about some of these issues, and they feel that they're not concerned and they understand the risks, then I'm happy to talk to them. But it's just that for so long as I'm their students, because in a way, they don't have a choice in me being their teacher, right? But once I'm no longer their teacher, they have a choice about whether they still want to talk to me about these things.
Now, my students, like this week, we did the China readings, and we also read your article on the free thinker in 2023.
Oh, wow.
So my students really liked it. We actually had two questions for you. One is that you're arguing that cultural differences between the left and right in Western countries are relatively marginal compared to so the true threat to democracy comes not from Trump, but from maybe like autocratic leaders like Xi Jinping. Would you elaborate on that? Do you think that?
Okay, I would. I think my views have evolved a little bit since 2023, especially now that I'm teaching in universities too. I would say two things about that. One is that I think it's clear that Trump, Trump in his second term is a different proposition to Trump in his first term. But that said, um, and this is a statement of political opinion, so feel free to disagree with me. I would say that one of the things that's been very in vogue in developed countries right now is this idea of, with Trump, you don't know what's next, but at least with China, you get certainty. And and my response to that would be that if it's a choice between an uncertain United States where sometimes it's on one view, I mean, definitely my view anyway, but I know others don't agree. On one view, positively awful right now, but at the same time, you're seeing checks and balances working in some ways. So, for example, the tariff decision we're seeing now, even these few days, birthright citizenship, the Supreme Court seemed to be very skeptical of what Trump is doing. And also the fact that America still has a political system that is capable of changes from some of these uncertainties. So would you so that's the uncertainty we get with America. With China, we get the certainty of an iron-fisted authoritarian state. So look, it's a little bit like what Winston Churchill used to say about democracy being the worst system around, except for all the others that have been tried from time to time, right? So with America, sometimes you're going to get a Trump or worse, but the system has some checks and balances, albeit imperfect, and there's room for change. With China, where's that room right now? So that's the first point. The second point is it's interesting you should raise that article that I wrote back in 2023. I have to say that now that I'm in an Australian academic environment, I am very concerned about the lack of diversity in opinions, especially in humanities faculties. I think there are, to use what saddened me, and even though I disagreed with this person on a lot of things, was that I once talked to a friend of mine who's a moderately conservative emeritus academic in the humanities space, and he said to me that he reckoned if he was starting out in academia now, he wouldn't get a job. And that to me, and don't get me wrong, I mean, I would have discussions with this guy where I disagree with him on plenty of things on domestic Australian political issues because I'm to his left. But it's saddening to see that that we've come to this, that we have people who have spent decades as eminent scholars feeling that, just as well they started their careers some decades ago. I know for a fact, and I'm not going to get into details because I need to protect people. It's strange, right? I'm talking like as if I'm in an authoritarian state, but where I've actually had students come up to me in after class discussions and all that, saying, there are all these things I want to say in class discussions, but I dare not say it. I won't elaborate on what it is because it risks outing people. But I'm scared of being called a racist, a sexist, a insufficiently progressive, too concerned about money, you name it. And I'm not saying there's no racism or sexism, but it does worry me if we, in the developed world, decide to self-censor in a way that, so just through sort of academic culture, in a way that authoritarian states like China and now through Hong Kong are doing through the backhand of the state.
Right.
Sorry, that was a bit of a long answer, Joseph, but yeah.
I actually sympathize with your concerns, and that's why we formed Heterodox Academy East Asia to promote academic freedom in East Asia. And I thought, and also we discussed in class how actually the Chinese media, so whenever they see cases of censorship in the US and in the West, they use that to excuse their own censorship in China. And so I think the Chinese media, they see like social media banning, Trump back in 2021, and they said, look, this is what's happening in the West. They're doing censorship too. And so China's not unique. And so I do agree with you that we need to promote, freedom in Australia and Western countries to really, to show that we can be a real model for countries like China. So,
and if I may add to that, what concerns me about the discourse environment right now in places like Australia is that you have groups that are that are willing that are only willing to um, defend the freedom of speech of, for example, critics of trans policies, right? But are not willing to defend the freedom of speech of people with more left-wing views. On the other hand, you also have people who are only willing to defend the freedom of speech of, if I may use that term in quotation marks, there are some who are only willing to defend the freedom of speech of anti-Zionists, but not willing to defend the freedom of speech of the anti-trans, well, not anti-trans, but the trans skeptic person, right? And I know that I'm talking about two ends of fairly, shall we say, controversial ideas in the public discourse domain. But as I see it right now, and you're right, it gets used by regimes like China to say, what's this about freedom of speech in the Western world anyway? But we are having people who in the West are only defending freedom of speech when those people exercising that freedom agrees with them. And I think that's a very scary thing.
Kevin, final question from our class discussion. The question is, do we engage China or do we contain China? So assuming that you're right, that China poses this authoritarian threat to the liberal international order, how do we, what should the strategy of democracies be, right? So for example, like Trump, he's, like in the US, they tried to ban TikTok. Trump is to ban, deny visas to Chinese students. That's what, is that the strategy that we should go for, to deny China, like, scientific, technological advancement? Or do we try to, engage China, welcome Chinese students to our borders and welcome Chinese companies? So what's your on that?
Okay, I wasn't born yesterday, okay? So I know that in this world, you've got to deal with unpleasant. Look, it's the same as being in a workplace, right? You can't go to an unpleasant colleague and say I'm never working with you again, right? We all have unpleasant colleagues. I'm sure your students who do group assignments have got unpleasant classmates, or at least classmates that they consider to be unpleasant. But when you've got a group assignment on and you've got to work with them, you've got to work with them. What I would use is an amended version of Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese's mantra. So his mantra on China is, we cooperate where we can and disagree where we must. I would amend that a little, and I would say, when it comes to not just China, but any authoritarian state, right? We cooperate where we must, and we disagree where we should. And I think that's probably the more pithy way I would put it.
Specifically, like Chinese student visas, okay, or do we want more Chinese students in Western countries or less?
I don't see why we shouldn't have. Well, the way I would put it is this. I wouldn't just say, I wouldn't want to single out Chinese students in this regard, right? I think it should just be, a country as an overall quota, and then students that meet various requirements can come in whether they're Chinese or not. And that quota will be determined by the policy and economic and other needs of that country. I don't like this idea of lessening or banning people just because they're from China. I think by doing that, that's actually an expression of insecurity on our part. We should be confident and we should believe in our ability to spread universal values while these students are in Western countries. And to the extent that there's been talk about Chinese students being used as vehicles of surveillance and being used to promote pro-Chinese Communist Party causes. We've got to remember that these people have got to go back home and they've got to do what they've got to do. Our task is not to just say kick them out unless there are really egregious individual cases where people have engaged in acts of transnational repression. Of course, in those individual cases, you kick those individuals out. But other than that, it's up to us to create an environment where these Chinese students feel like they don't have to toe the party line quite so much. It's up to us to have the confidence that the universal values that we are into would have an influence on these Chinese students rather than the other way around.
Okay, thank you so much. Francis, back to you.
Yes, so I do see that we've reached the hour. So this will be the official close of the forum. So of course, I guess if anybody wants to stick around for further discussion, then we are welcome to do that as well. Kevin, how does that sound to you if anyone has further questions?
Yeah, if there are further questions here, I'm happy to answer them. But if not, then happy Easter, for those who have recently just broken the Ramadan fast, happy. Sorry, what's the phrase? Mubarak something. Sorry, it's my fault. I should know. And for those of you who are about to celebrate Passover, happy Passover. So, yeah.
It's a happy day for so many cultures. Okay, all my students, let's give them a round of applause. Great, thank you. And then, wave. Thank you so much, Kevin. That was wonderful. And it was a real call for universal liberalism. Okay.
Yes, thank you so much.
Thank you.